South Africa's new minimum wage kicked off on March 1st, 2022. This means that for every ordinary hour worked, instead of 21.69 Rand, the wage increased to 23.19 Rand. This represents an increase of 6.9% from 2021. The national minimum wage forms the minimum floor for wages. This means that every worker will be entitled to at least the minimum wage, and no employer may pay less than that wage. The minimum wage cannot be varied by contract, collective agreement, or law, except to the extent that an employee's contract of employment, a collective agreement, or law provides for a more favorable wage. The national minimum wage is the amount payable in money for ordinary hours worked by an employee and excludes payments of allowances such as transportation, tools, food, accommodation, payments in kind, bonuses, tips, and gifts. Now, unlike previous years, no specific worker groups have been provided exceptions, with the minimum wages for domestic workers and farm workers now also set at 23.19 Rand for each ordinary hour worked as part of a planned equalization push. This represents a 21.5% increase for domestic workers. The National Minimum Wage Commission considers certain factors when determining the annual adjustment: inflation, the cost of living, and the need to maintain the value of the minimum wage, gross domestic product, wage levels, and collective bargaining outcomes, as well as productivity, employers' ability to carry on their businesses successfully, the operation of SMEs and new enterprises, and the likely impact of the recommendation, adjustment on employment, or the creation of employment. Today, we're focusing on South Africa's new national minimum wage. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adileru Balogun. Joining me from Johannesburg, South Africa is Trevor Shaku, spokesperson for the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Trevor, welcome to Minimum Wage. Welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having us.
All right, so let's do a bit of a background on this new national minimum wage. This is the third adjustment since the National Minimum Wage Act was first proclaimed in 2018. And this is actually, that Minimum Wage Act is a historic precedent that South Africa has put in place in order to protect low-earning or vulnerable workers in the country. So since the proclamation in 2018, do you think the aims of the act have started being met, especially with the adjustment that has kicked in for 2022?
There is a better improvement, at least as insofar as things are. For instance, in 2018, when the minimum wage started, you had the farm workers and domestic workers earning low rates. For instance, a farm worker at the time, his minimum wage was set at 15 rands per hour, and a domestic workers was set at about 13 rands per hour. Now, gradually that has been increased, and this year at least, you see the minimum wage for the farm workers and the domestic workers, joining those of cleaners, securities, and landscapers and gardeners at least 23 rand 19 cents. That translates into something like 485 rands per month. Now, that is a little bit better in the sense that you have seen an increase, and actually the increase from last year to this year represents an above consumer price index inflationary trends. So in that sense, it represents a real increase. However, even in 2018, when the minimum wage was promulgated and introduced, the South African Federation of Trade Unions registered its dissatisfaction with the fact that though we appreciate the idea of the national minimum wage because it sets a precedent for every employer not to especially protect the vulnerable, not to be exploited. So yeah, not to be exploited by their employers. We rate that the minimum wage must also be a living wage. That means it must be a decent payment which enables the ordinary worker to be able to afford the basic services and goods.
And that's interesting. It's something I want us to get to because of how many people your confederation actually represents. But let's talk about the numbers now. It's 21 Rand 69 cents, moving now to 23 Rand 19 cents. Is this sufficient? Was this really the only increment that was on the table, or this was the one that seemed to be a bit more of a compromise between what South Africa is aiming for and some of the realities that the country finds itself in?
I think on the part of Labour, especially us who represent a radical voice of workers, this is not enough. Like I said, for instance, because one thing which is a determining factor in our view, and that should always remain as a determining factor for wage increments on a yearly basis, should be inflationary increases. But the other problem which is not taken into consideration is the conditions, especially of Black workers in this country. You have a total population of about 60 million, and you have out of that, I think around 23 million of those are what we call the labor force. But in totality, you have about more than 46% of those labor force unemployed, and 14 million are the ones who are currently in forms of employment. Now, if you have, for instance, the population of that magnitude, it tells you that most of the workers who are employed are breadwinners and are looking after extended families of about 4 to 5 members. Now, the household affordability index in the country put the cost of a household grocery monthly at 4,335. Now, on its own, it shows you that the 23 Rand and 19 cents minimum wage introduced, if you translate it into a monthly income, it gives you about 3,850. That alone is not enough to ensure that such particular workers are able to take care of their households. And as a result, it presents a serious problem for us. However, like I said, what we also have cautioned even at the beginning is that this particular minimum wage must be a decent wage. That is, it should be able to afford the basic grocery of a household, but beyond that, because a household does not necessarily survive on a grocery. There are other essentials that a household must procure. But in this instance, if you have such particular low rates, which are even below the estimate average of monthly grocery, you must assume that even on other essentials that a household require, therefore that particular worker will not be able to afford. And it is on that basis that we are still critical of the minimum wage, even though we appreciate that it is at least gradually increasing.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because what I also found is that, as you said, if a domestic worker or even farm worker who are also now part of this new national minimum wage, they would earn around 185 Rand 52 cents per day, taking home just under 4,000 Rand a month. Groceries are about to take up about 3,000 Rand in that monthly salary. But then it also begs the question, this is just the first time that domestic workers and farm workers are being included in the new national minimum wage. So why is it important to bring this group now into the national minimum wage scheme?
It's because these are the two sectors which have been highly exploited. The exploitation in the farm sector, especially because of the colonial and apartheid legacies, which have left a Black farm worker being seriously exploited by mostly white farm owners. In the instance, you then required, because in most instances you'll find cases where these farm owners would give farm workers money, not standardized, for instance, there would have been cases of farm workers who reported that they are not paid a consistent amount of money throughout the months. So in most instances, they'll be subjected to the good willing of the employer himself or herself. In that instance, it was important to ensure that you bring the farm workers into the minimum wage because they're the most vulnerable and protect them. But also the domestic workers are the most vulnerable workers in the country because the amount that were paid to them were varying. And there was nothing that regulates that. So depending on the amount that an employer of a domestic worker has, or at least brings as their monthly income, such would be used to determine the wages of those domestic workers. So it is important indeed to standardize across the board the wages of these workers who are in the vulnerable sectors. And in that instance, you must be able to, first and foremost, ensure that there is a minimum wage that begins to move towards a decent wage. At the current moment, like we say, in comparison to the costs of groceries, in comparison to the headline inflation, this is not yet a minimum wage that is decent, but it is indeed important that we begin to put it there so that workers begin to have a standardized form of wages in the country.
All right, before we go for a break, I want to get to a caveat that the South African government added to the announcement of the new national minimum wage, and that was that it is illegal for employers to change working hours or other employment conditions in order to implement the minimum wage. And this sort of presupposes that businesses will be able to affect this change. But there have been a number of criticisms, or let's say maybe concerns expressed about the ability of small businesses and even other formalized businesses in the private sector to really take on this new national minimum wage. So was there pushback from the private sector in regards to moving the minimum wage to 23 Rand 19 cents?
Yeah, there's always a pushback. A pushback from the part of the private sector. One of the reasons that they are citing is that they are blaming our country of having what they call red tapes. And with red tapes, quickly they are referring to regulations that the Department of Employment Labor is putting forward to ensure that it mitigates the process of employment and exploitation. So what the private sector is trying to do is always to try to push back, and they're blaming the minimum wage as a deterrent, not of the economy to grow, but also as a deterrent that leads various businesses to collapse. And as a result of that, most of employer organizations have always come out to push back against the increases in the minimum wage.
All right, Trevor, hold on. We're going to take a break. But when we come back, I want to get to what it means, what this new national minimum wage means for your Federation of Trade Unions. You represent a massive number of affiliated unions as well as workers in South Africa. Would this really be a wage that can take home the workers, that can really help them take something valuable home? So we'll pick up the thread of the conversation when we come back. You're watching Business Edge, and the conversation is on South Africa's new national minimum wage, moving from 21 Rand thereabouts to 23 Rand 19 cents. Is it really something that can take South Africans home? Stay with us. And still with me on Business Edge is Trevor Shaku, spokesperson of the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Today, the conversation is focused on the country's new national minimum wage. Now, the South African Federation of Trade Unions is the second largest of South Africa's main trade union confederations. It has 21 affiliated trade unions organizing about 800,000 workers. So, Trevor, let me now ask you, with this increase in the minimum wage now, how does it help, or what does it do for your members? Again, given the fact that in many African countries, when we see an increase in wages, we're seeing also an increase in the cost of living. And South Africans have been told to brace up for an increase in electricity and petrol prices as well. So what would this increase do for your members? Trevor, I think you're muted. Please check your audio.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, there you go.
The increase, as I said, we welcomed it on the basis of the fact that it standardized things and it improves some of the incomes of the vulnerable workers. Farm workers were earning 50 rands before the introduction of the minimum wage. Now they will be earning around 185 per day. Now, that is something that we must commend. However, the position of the Federation has always been that we demand a decent wage. And this is a point I'm repeating. However, our measurement of the decent wage has always been determined on the basis of the mine worker strikes of 2012, which had set a 12.5 as a minimum wage, which the labor in this country must aspire towards. And in that instance, you then have a continued criticism on the basis that, one, we have not arrived at the 12,500 minimum wage, which we aspire towards. But secondly, you have a minimum wage that, while standardizing the payment of vulnerable workers, it also is not decent, but also does not afford, or at least assist the workers to be able to afford the basic goods and services. And in the context of the ailing economy, where more and more of our people are losing employment, that puts a burden on the fraction of those workers who are currently still in any form of employment, because it means the people who rely on them for financial support and for material support keep on increasing as they begin to look after extended families and that. And in fact, one of the studies which was published by Oxfam showed that about 4 in every 10 of Black women look after they look after household and their single parents, and of those, 40% of them are looking after extended families. Now, this shows you that the burden, first and foremost, of unemployment links directly with the burden of low payment or low remuneration of our workers. And it is in this instance that the South African Federation of Trade Unions sees it necessary to ensure that there is a proper wage standard set as a national minimum wage, which is decent, so that these workers will be able to take some of the burdens at ease without the hardship that they are facing at the current moment. And secondly, this must be linked with the programs to ensure that there is employment creation, because employment creation will ease the burden on those who currently are carrying the burden of looking after extended families, because some of those particular people will begin employment and will be able to look after themselves. Thirdly, is that government must ensure that it expands its fiscus to ensure that it funds what we call the basic income grant, which we are campaigning for in this country, so that because of the contradictions of capitalism, which creates structural unemployment, therefore leading, at least in this country at the current moment, to 12.5 million of unemployed people, that there should be a basic income grant for those people. And that on its own will also assist in ensuring that the minimum wage, which is meager, is not spread through for many, to support many people in a household, but that those adults in such households would also have a form of income through which they can survive on.
So I want to take you up on some of the criticisms, or rather concerns, let me use that word, that many have talked about, particularly analysts. So the National Minimum Wage Commission says it looks at inflation, the cost of living, the GDP, operations of SMEs, and even new enterprises when it decides how to set the national minimum wage. But a number of analysts have expressed worry that they think South Africa can barely afford to increase the national minimum wage, pointing to such factors as the high inflation, high unemployment, and the public debt. What are your responses to those concerns, even as there are those who say that the increase could further strain companies and lead to job losses? Is this even the time to increase the minimum wage?
It is definitely the time to increase the minimum wage. But I will have to give you my response in two categories. The first category must be directed at private sector itself. You see, they say this is not the time because the minimum wage might be a deterrent to the economic growth factor and all that. But let me tell you this, the South African capitalists who are investors at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange are estimated by the University of Johannesburg study group to be holding about 1.4 trillion of investable money, but they are not investing that. That means there is money in the private sector, but the capitalists are not willing to invest that in expanding production and ensuring that there is employment creation. but also in ensuring that such a share of surplus is shared with the workers in terms of increasing the minimum wage. So it is absolutely hypocritical of the private sector to be at the current moment be criticizing or saying to us that they cannot afford the minimum wage and the minimum wage is a deterrent of growth. Secondly, we must point out the very hypocrisy of the private sector, because you have in this country 10% of the population, top population, who earn as much wealth and are worth as much wealth equivalent to the 80% of the total population of this country. You have 3,500 rich capitalists who at the current moment are owning wealth and earning an income that is equivalent of the wealth owned by 30 million of the total population of this country. So it is very hypocritical, and this must be pointed out, because these are people who are not willing to invest, but most importantly, who are continuing to benefit from whooping profits in the corporates at the expense of workers they're exploiting. And we cannot accept that. South Africa is the most unequal is the most unequal country in the world because of those income disparities which have been created by super exploitation of the South African worker. We do not accept any fight back or resistance from the private sector on the basis that the national minimum wage would be a deterrent of growth. We definitely and absolutely refuse to accept their explanation or their waning. On the part of government, of course, there is a talk about the government growth, the government deficit expanding at an unsustainable level, and that on its own is a testament that you cannot expand the minimum, so you cannot increase the national minimum wage, especially for the expanded public works program. If you check in the minimum wage standards which were published at the end of February and effected in the beginning of March, there is a category of workers they call the extended public works program. Those are the workers employed by the public sector, and the minimum wage has been increased to 12 rand 550 cents. That is nothing. It is actually, for those who are working 11 days per month, it is equivalent to 1,100 rands per month. And to those who are working 21 days per month, it is equivalent to 2,100. That on its own is not enough. But of course, they are motivating it by saying that the government's debt, deficit and debt levels have grown to unsustainable levels and government cannot expand its fiscus. But we say they are not correct in saying that. One, there is still a capacity for government to spend. And you can look throughout the economy, but even in the fiscus itself. One, the corporate tax has been reduced from 52% at the peak during apartheid to 27% last year. Secondly, you have the super rich, which I quoted, the 3,500 and the 10% who own have the wealth and the riches of this country, equivalent to 80% of the population, that must be taxed. In addition, you have the illicit financial flows, which cost this country 450 billion rands yearly because of mispricing, tax dodging committed by the very multinational corporations. So there is room to spending. In effect, South Africa is a sovereign country in terms of currency. So we have the capacity to spend, and we can always run the bond issuance to ensure that expand the capacity of government to spend, and that it can be able to increase the wages, especially the national minimum wage of the workers in the public works, who are about 1 million to 2 million in total. Sorry.
All right, Trevor, it feels like this conversation is just starting, because there are also labor concerns as well. There are a few strikes that have happened, and there are concerns about whether or not this new national minimum wage will have any effect on the negotiations and discussions that are ongoing. But I think we'll have to pick up this conversation with you another time. Trevor Shaku, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to coming back.
All right. And as my guest pointed out, unfortunately, South Africa is seen as the most unequal society in the world. And there are also conversations happening right now about a universal basic income grant. But right now, 46% of South Africa's population actually receives some form of social grant or the other in the country. How long can South Africa maintain this, and can a new national minimum wage plus plugging gaps and taxing the rich finally help to find a balance for the inequality? That's a conversation we'll have to pick up some other time. You're watching Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And here are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. And we start in South Africa, where a South African labor union, Solidarity, has said that it would challenge a move by Sibanye-Stillwater to lock out its members as other unions begin a strike at the company's gold mines. The National Union of Mine Workers and the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union called for a strike over wages. This comes after Solidarity broke ranks last week and accepted the company's final offer of a 5% annual pay increase. Oil prices rose on Thursday in volatile trade following a sharp drop in the previous session as the market contemplated whether major producers would boost supply to help plug the gap in output from Russia due to sanctions for its invasion of Ukraine. Brent crude futures were up $2.53 to $113.67 a barrel. The benchmark contract slumped 13% in the previous session in its biggest one-day drop in nearly 2 years. Kenya has signed 7 bilateral agreements with Zimbabwe, even as President Uhuru Kenyatta joined the push for the removal of Western sanctions, sapping the economy of the nation. Kenya and Zimbabwe signed the bilateral agreements, all memoranda of understanding on political and diplomatic consultations, tourism and wildlife conservation, and civil aircraft accidents, as well as serious incidents investigation.